I'm an investor. I spend my days absorbing an almost overwhelming amount of data and information. And I do that because I'm looking for patterns that provide me insight into the markets and how we live our lives connected to them. I'm also a buy and hold investor, which means that I don't look at short-term ups and downs. I don't look at individual transactions. I try to pay close attention to things that affect us on a macro scale, things to watch over time. Because if I can identify the right things to watch over time, then I can spot opportunities. I can spot them before they're apparent to other people, and that's what the investing game is all about. Interestingly, I never used that skill to sit with large data sets, to spot important data points, and to watch patterns over long periods of time. I never used that in my ordinary life. But that all changed. That changed in the fall of 2015. It changed in a meeting halfway around the world in London. And what I learned in that meeting is my idea worth sharing with you today. But before I can talk about that meeting, I want to demystify some of the investment talk. We often think of it as analytical and impersonal, but in fact, it's highly personal. It's highly contextual, and it's driven by our feelings. After all, we are human beings. And that fall, I was all up in my feelings. You remember Sandra Bland? This is Sandra Bland. She was 28, driving across the country to take a new job in Texas when she was pulled over by a police officer for a minor traffic offense. And you remember what was happening in the United States in the summer of 2015, a few months before Freddie Gray had been murdered in Baltimore. And the year before that, we were all on edge from the murders of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, and Tamir Rice. And the year before that was the heartbreaking murder of Trayvon Martin. So in this context, Sandra Bland gets pulled over by a cop. The exchange is hostile. She tries to protest and assert her power unsuccessfully. She's violently arrested and booked into jail. 3 days later, she's dead. Her body was found hanging from a privacy partition in her cell. The privacy partition was 5 feet tall. Sandra Bland was almost 6 feet tall. Her death was ruled a suicide, and at that time, America was in a boil, but Black women in particular, we were overcome with grief. Even though we didn't know her personally, we all felt like we saw in Sandra, we saw our friends, we saw our mothers, we saw our aunts. In Sandra, I saw myself. And in that disorienting grief, I finally turned to my aptitude for numbers to try to understand the context in a different way. When I did that, I started asking questions for which there were numerical answers, questions about my people, like how many of us are there? How much do we earn? How has that earning changed over time? What's our home ownership rate? And interestingly, when I came across those numbers, I also discovered an important data point. And that data was that the average African American family was worth about $6,500. The net wealth of the average family was $6,500. When I saw that number, I thought, that sounds low, right? Doesn't it sound low? So as I looked around, I discovered that it is low. In fact, it's about 6% of what the average family is worth in the United States. The average family is worth $110,000. So as I noodled on that, I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't be totally Debbie Downer about the number. It's low, but maybe it's improved over time. So as I tried to figure out, how do you calculate the wealth of African Americans over a very long period of time? Where do you start? How do you find the net wealth of an emancipated slave? And net wealth is a really important concept. You get to it by adding up all the things you can sell and subtracting from that number all the debts that you owe. The difference is net wealth. So I got to thinking, how do I find the net wealth of an emancipated slave? Couldn't find an answer, so fishing around research, I discovered that in Washington, D.C., at the time of emancipation, slave owners were given a $300 tax credit for every emancipated male. So I took that tax credit as a proxy for net wealth at emancipation. Now, before you get incensed about that, using a tax credit, I acknowledge that using a tax credit is a vulgar and inadequate proxy for personal worth. But remember, I was trying to estimate personal wealth. So I started with $300. I had a beginning point in 1861 of $300. I knew that in 2010, the average wealth was $6,500, and I needed to just understand what happened in the 150 years in between. Well, it turns out if you grow $300 from 1861 to present at inflation, what you get is $6,500. I had spotted my data point. I had identified the important pattern. Over 150 years from the moment we walked off the plantation, we had the same wealth. And one of the reasons why we hadn't brought our economic power to bear to stop the violence like what we saw with Sandra Bland and with Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and all the other people who didn't make the national news, is because it really wasn't that different from the day we were emancipated. I struggled with this information, but my life had to go on, right? That summer was intense, but our work had to go on. So that fall, I boarded a plane to London in search of new investments for Meyer Trust. One of my last meetings was at a bank. I walked into the bank. It was an old English bank, beautiful wood-paneled walls, plush carpet. As I was escorted to our meeting room, I noticed there were framed replicas of historic financings on the walls. I got to the meeting early, so I had some time to actually look at the framed replicas. And it turns out they were Scottish and English bonds issued to finance infrastructure in the expansion of the American colonies in the South. Then it struck me. This bank had financed the slave trade. And there I was, the descendant of enslaved people, about to have an investment conversation with the people who had built tremendous wealth from our enslavement. And remember how I was feeling, right? I was still processing Sandra Bland. I was really struggling with my composure. And I was trying to listen on the one hand and be my external self, be analytical, be focused, be composed, and be graceful in the face of this crazy fact. But inside I was torn up. I was torn up trying to process this information. And I couldn't help but go back to Sandra Bland, and I thought, I'm the same as Sandra Bland. People like us are worth about $6,500. $6,500 today is the same as $300 in 1861. In 1861, if you were worth $300, you were also exploited. Now here's the big jump, and this is what I made in that meeting, and I hope you can make the jump with me. If you are worth $300, your labor is exploited, your life is also full of dehumanizing terror, right? Think about that. What did it mean for the slaves to be emancipated? What does it mean that the wealth of my people hasn't changed over 150 years? Well, I'm not surprised that Sandra Bland has been in danger, that we're all in danger, because this hasn't changed. The fundamental equation hadn't changed. And people who are exposed to inhumane terror, they don't have power. And I sat there in that meeting and I thought, well, I'm just like that. I don't have power. And I was losing my composure in that meeting. But then I realized I was sitting at the head of the table. And all of a sudden, it became clear to me that they were pitching to me. I had the money, right? They were asking me to make an investment. And for the first time in my life, maybe the first time in my life, in the lives of my descendants for many years before I had the power. So after looking at the framed replica, side by side with a oil painting of those guys, and you know who those guys are, I stopped the meeting and said, "You can assume that I've read your materials and prepared. I need to know more about your firm. I want to know what you learned from financing slavery." The power I had that day was to divert the conversation from the traditional investment topics to things that mattered to me, right? And I had that power because I had the wealth. I controlled the wealth. And that made me think about Sandra. It made me wonder what might the difference between $6,500 and $110,000 have been for Sandra that day? I wonder, without the yoke of centuries of aggressions and violence and terror, might she have interacted with the police officer in a way that was more akin to talking with a colleague or a friend? I wonder if the police officer would have treated her differently if he saw her as one of the 110,000ers instead of one of the 6,500ers. And most painfully, I wonder if he would have treated her differently if it had not been true that her wealth was exactly the same as the amount the government deemed her people to be worth in the hands of their slave owners. So that brings me to my idea worth sharing. We have to get comfortable with talking about wealth. We have to get comfortable talking about wealth in a racialized context. I am forcing us to talk about it because I see my people don't have it. Even if we frame this in terms of our common wealth, if you're uncomfortable talking about financial wealth, things like our national parks, our research institutions, our police forces, and increasingly our healthcare system, we're even making an appeal to an undivided share of our common wealth, the wealth that we've helped to build over this 150 years. Because isn't the statement that Black Lives Matter or Stop Killing Us, aren't those just statements that we should have an undivided share of another form of commonwealth in public safety? So this is my call to action to you. My call to action to you as custodians of American institutions and the caretakers of our commonwealth is to think about how you're involved in that transaction in taking wealth from African Americans and delivering it to other people, because we're all a part of it. You're a part of it when you make decisions about hiring people. You're a part of it when you make decisions about promoting people. You're a part of it when you make decisions about how you vote on education funding. You're a part of it when you make decisions about where you live. Gentrification is not coming from nowhere. That wealth isn't appearing out of thin air. It's really important that you all think about that because we're thinking deeply about it. African Americans have made the moral case to own our bodies. We've made the legal case to own an undivided share of our Constitution. And now we need some help. We need some help making the final step in owning an undivided share of American freedom. Please help us. Thank you.